"Get that crying baby out of here, this is not a damn daycare." The words sliced through the quiet like a blade, sharp and cruel. Heads turned, forks froze midair. The ambient jazz, once elegant, now felt mocking. A billionaire CEO sat in the center of it all, frozen, not because he didn't hear the insult, but because he didn't know what to do. His son, 11-month-old Theo, was screaming, not fussing, not crying softly, screaming red-faced, fists clenched, as if the world had betrayed him. Richard Langston, a man worth $3.8 billion, according to Forbes, who had negotiated mergers, crushed boardrooms, and dismantled empires, with a stare now looked like a man cornered. His designer suit couldn't hide the sweat pooling near his collar. The room, filled with Manhattan's finest, began to buzz with judgment. He tried everything. A pacifier, a bottle, his assistant's help. Nothing worked. And now, his night was spiraling into a public relations nightmare. Until she walked in. From behind the velvet curtains separating the dining room from the kitchen, a young black waitress stepped forward. Simple ponytail, clean white sneakers, pressed apron, and eyes that didn't flinch. "Let me try," she said gently. The manager shook his head, mouthing something about protocol. Richard didn't even glance, he just nodded. He was out of options and out of pride. She approached, arms open, voice soft like a lullaby, and within seconds, silence. Not the awkward kind, not the forced kind. The kind of silence that feels like peace, the kind no one could buy. Some stared in disbelief. Others whispered, surprised that the one person who wasn't supposed to matter just became the most important one in the room. This wasn't just a moment. It was the start of something bigger. A story not about wealth, but about grace. Not about noise, but about presence. This is a black story worth remembering, and you'll want to stay till the end. Because what happened next changed more than just one night. Amara Johnson wasn't supposed to be on the floor that night. Her shift was a last-minute swap. Her roommate had an exam, and Amara needed the extra hours to help cover their electricity bill. That's the kind of thing people like her did: adjusted, adapted, kept going, even when no one noticed. At 23, Amara lived in a modest third-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, split between 3 roommates. She studied psychology at NYU during the day, then clocked in at Maison Lennox, a high-end French restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, most evenings. She didn't love serving overpriced foie gras to people who rarely looked her in the eye, but it paid, and she was used to the double takes. People often assumed she was just there to bus tables or clean restrooms, not because of how she acted, but because of who she was: a young black woman, working in a place where waitstaff usually didn't look like her. Amara had grown used to the microaggressions, the smiles that weren't really smiles, the "can I speak to someone else?" glances, the way customers sometimes waved her over like she was invisible until they needed something, and yet, she never let it show. Her mother had always told her, "You walk with dignity even when they won't give you the floor." Her beauty was undeniable, but understated: smooth skin, sharp cheekbones, warm eyes that held stories she didn't often share. Her uniform was always pressed, her shoes spotless. She never wore perfume or bold colors, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew the unspoken rules of spaces like this. Be perfect, but not too much. What no one at that restaurant knew, not the guests, not even her manager, was that Amara had spent 3 summers volunteering at a children's grief camp. She'd held toddlers who had lost parents, talked 8-year-olds through panic attacks, taught teens how to breathe through the pain. She wasn't just kind, she was trained. And yet, none of that mattered in a room full of people who only saw her as the black girl who brings the wine. Until that moment. Until that baby cried. Until the room filled with discomfort and sideways glances. Until the billionaire froze. And Amara Johnson stepped forward, not to be noticed, but to serve. Not just food, but something rarer. Something the entire room had forgotten how to give. Humanity. It happened just 30 minutes before the baby cried. Amara was serving table 7, a group of well-dressed men in custom suits and Rolex watches, clearly regulars. One of them, older, mid-50s, silver hair, cufflinks shaped like dollar signs, was particularly loud. He had already waved her off once when she offered him sparkling water, grunted when she asked about his steak temperature. Typical. But it was when she bent down to pick up a napkin from the floor that it happened. He chuckled and said, just loud enough for the others to hear, "Guess they'll let anyone in these days, huh? You must be one of those diversity hires." The table burst into uncomfortable laughter. Not real laughter. The kind men use when they don't want to challenge the one holding the check. Amara froze. Just for a second. Long enough to register that it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was meant to sting. She stood up slowly, spine straight, face calm, but her eyes said everything. She looked him dead in the face and smiled. "Would you like lemon with that?" she asked, her voice even, her tone professional. He waved her off again. "I'm good, sweetheart. Just bring the check, and maybe smile a little more. You people have such pretty teeth." This time, the laughter was louder. And Amara turned on her heel, walked straight back into the kitchen, past the swinging doors, and into the employee locker room. She didn't cry. Not at first. She just stood there, hands gripping the edge of the metal sink, staring at her reflection under the harsh fluorescent lights, her pulse in her ears, her jaw clenched tight. Then it came. A single tear, then another. Not because of the words, but because of how normal it felt. How many times had this happened in smaller ways? The comments, the stares, the fake compliments, the pitying smiles. It wasn't new. But tonight, something in her broke. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the silence that followed the way no one from the staff stepped in. Not the manager. Not even the bartender who had overheard everything. She wiped her face quickly, fixed her collar, and straightened her name tag. Because Amara Johnson knew one thing. Dignity doesn't wait for justice. Sometimes, you bring it with you even if no one else is willing to offer it. And with that, she stepped back out onto the floor. Just in time to hear a baby start crying. It started as a whimper. A soft, restless sound, the kind babies make when they're tired, overstimulated, or just done with the world. No one paid attention at first. In a restaurant full of crystal glassware and hushed voices, background noise was expected. But then the whimper grew louder. By the time the lobster risotto was served at table 9, baby Theo Langston was screaming. Not fussing, not the cute, high-pitched wail of a baby needing a diaper change. This was deeper, raw, a guttural cry that came from his chest, red face, fists clenched, eyes wide with panic. He sounded like he was in pain, like something inside him had cracked open and there were no words, only noise. Richard Langston, the billionaire tech CEO with a reputation for being ice-cold in negotiations, sat helplessly in his chair. His face was stone, but his eyes were bloodshot. The kind of exhaustion that no amount of money could fix. He had tried everything. He offered Theo a bottle, a pacifier, a toy shaped like a rocket ship. His personal assistant, Karen, even tried playing calming music from her phone under the table, classical Mozart, baby edition. Nothing worked. The cries only grew louder. Customers began shifting in their seats. A man in a navy blazer let out an audible sigh. A woman turned around with a dramatic headshake. One couple asked their server to move them to the back patio, even though it was drizzling outside. And Richard just sat there, bouncing Theo gently on his lap, murmuring empty words. "It's okay, buddy. Come on now." But it wasn't okay. Not for Theo, not for Richard, not for anyone in that room. Theo had been like this ever since his mother passed 3 months ago, unexpectedly, in her sleep. Since then, Richard had been trying to juggle million-dollar board meetings and midnight feedings. Most days, he managed to hold it all together. Tonight was not one of those nights. The pressure, the whispers, the heat rising in the back of his neck, the embarrassment. This was his worst fear unfolding in real time. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a father on the edge. And his son was crying so loudly, it felt like the whole world was watching him fall apart. Amara wasn't supposed to be part of the scene unfolding before her. But as the baby's cries rattled through the marble and glass of Maison Lenox, something shifted in her body. She had carried trays. She had taken orders. She had endured microaggressions with a polite smile all night. But this wasn't about service. This was about instinct. From across the room, she could see Richard Langston crumbling, the man who had been on the cover of Forbes, the man whispered about in tech circles like some kind of prophet. He was now a father with shaking hands and a red-faced baby who refused to be soothed. Guests were turning their heads, their expressions ranging from irritated to disgusted. A woman near the corner table was already searching her purse, likely for noise-canceling earbuds. Another man gave Richard a glare that said everything: "Control your child." That was the moment Amara stepped forward. She wasn't sure what she would do, only that she couldn't do nothing. She approached slowly, pausing just a few feet from the high chair where Theo wailed, red and panicked. "Let me try," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Troy, the restaurant manager, stiffened at the bar. "Amara, that's not your place," he muttered, clearly nervous. "This is not your table. That's Langston. We can't risk." But Richard looked up. And in his eyes, Amara didn't see power. She didn't see status. She saw a man silently begging for help. He gave her the smallest nod. She stepped forward. Kneeling beside Theo, she didn't make a sound. No baby talk, no sudden movements, just presence. Her arms extended, offering comfort, not control. To everyone's disbelief, Theo leaned in. She scooped him up gently, letting his head rest against her shoulder, pressing him into the rhythm of her breath. Her arms wrapped around him not like a stranger, but like someone who understood pain and didn't ask questions about it. Within seconds, the noise stopped. The screaming melted into a few shaky hiccups. Then, silence. A thick, reverent silence. The room was stunned. Forks paused. Conversations froze mid-sentence. For a few seconds, even the music seemed to hold its breath. And in the middle of it all, Amara stood still, rocking a billionaire's baby as if he were her own. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just held him. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do in a world full of noise is care. The silence that followed was not the kind people celebrated. It was the kind that made people shift in their seats, unsure of what to say or how to feel. A few guests stared in awe, their expressions softening as they watched the baby melt into Amara's arms like he had known her all his life. Others didn't hide their discomfort not at the baby, but at who had silenced him. It wasn't lost on anyone that Amara was a young black woman holding the baby of one of America's wealthiest white CEOs. And that contrast, that unexpected image stirred up reactions that had little to do with the baby. At table 7, the same man who had insulted Amara earlier leaned back in his chair and muttered under his breath, "Of course, kids always calm down for the help." His friends laughed. Not because it was funny, but because no one wanted to be the one who didn't. A woman in a silk dress whispered to her husband. She must have been a nanny before. That kind of touch doesn't come from nowhere. Her voice carried just enough to be overheard, and she didn't seem to care. Then there were others. At the back of the room, a young couple exchanged glances, visibly moved. The woman pulled out her phone, clearly recording not for gossip, but because, in her words, this is the kind of grace people need to see. Even the head chef, who had never once spoken directly to Amara in 6 months of working there, stepped out of the kitchen to watch. His expression was unreadable. The manager, Troy, stood frozen, his hands on the counter, his lips pressed into a tight line. He knew this moment wasn't going away. Whether he liked it or not, something significant had just happened and everyone knew it. Amara didn't respond to any of it. She wasn't thinking about opinions, or whispers, or whether someone would post her on TikTok. Her entire focus was the small, warm body resting against her shoulder. She gently rocked Theo, one hand patting his back, the other holding him close like an anchor. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She just needed him to feel safe. But the room was learning something, whether it wanted to or not. Grace can be silent. And truth? It shows up whether you clap for it or not. When the final bite of dessert had been cleared, and the room returned to its usual quiet hum, Richard Langston stood up. He moved carefully, not with the brisk, authoritative pace of a man used to being followed, but with the caution of someone walking across thin ice. He approached Amara near the service station, where she was gently shifting Theo to keep him asleep on her shoulder. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," he said finally. Amara didn't turn right away. She adjusted Theo's position, making sure his tiny head was supported before replying, "You're welcome." There was a pause, not awkward, just real, heavy with things neither of them knew how to put into words. "She's been gone 3 months, Richard said softly, almost to himself. "His mom. It's been hard." Amara nodded. "I'm sorry. Loss like that doesn't follow a schedule." He looked at her then, really looked. Not like a billionaire sizing up a server, but like a man noticing the person behind the uniform. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara," she said. "It means grace." Richard nodded slowly, as if that explained something he hadn't understood until now. He glanced down at Theo, now completely still in Amara's arms, his breath slow and even. "You calmed him like no one else has," Richard said, a trace of wonder in his voice. "Not even me." "I didn't do anything special," she said, but there was warmth in her tone. "I just held him." "Sometimes," he replied, "that's everything." Another pause, more comfortable this time. Amara finally looked him in the eyes, not with challenge, not with fear, but with steady presence. "Kids don't need much," she said. "They just need to know someone's not going to leave when it gets loud." Richard blinked. That sentence hit deeper than he expected. "I'm not sure I'm very good at this," he admitted. "No one is," Amara replied. "Not at first." For a man who had dominated rooms with words, tonight he was silent more than not. And maybe that was the first step, not talking over the pain, but listening to it. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone listened to him too. That night, after the restaurant had emptied and the last of the silverware was stacked, Amara stayed late to finish closing duties. Theo had long since been returned to Richard's arms, sleeping soundly, still clinging to the sleeve of Amara's uniform until the very last second. She hadn't expected him to wait, but he did. Richard stood near the coat check, holding Theo with one arm, his jacket slung over the other, looking far from the high-powered executive the media loved to dissect. He looked like a man holding the pieces of a world he didn't know how to rebuild. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward earlier," he said as she approached. Amara gave a small smile. "You didn't, not compared to everything else tonight." He gave a short breath, part laugh, part sigh. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Amara nodded. You handled him like you'd done it 100 times. That wasn't just instinct, was it?" She hesitated. For the first time that night, her confidence wavered just slightly. "My mom was a nurse," she said quietly. "Mostly worked hospice care. At night, she'd babysit for kids in our building. A lot of them had parents who worked double shifts or didn't come home at all." She paused, eyes fixed on a smudge on the marble floor. "I used to help her. Learned early how to hold a crying child, how to breathe slow enough that they started breathing with you." Richard said nothing. "She passed last year," Amara added. "COVID complications. By the time they took her seriously, it was too late." Richard's grip on Theo tightened. "She waited 6 hours in an ER waiting room," she continued, "was told someone with insurance would get seen first." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just truth, laid out plain and bare. "I'm so sorry," Richard said softly. Amara shrugged gently. "You don't have to be. I carry her with me. Every time I help someone breathe again." It wasn't meant to be profound, but it hit Richard harder than any keynote he'd ever heard. In her quiet strength, he saw everything he'd been missing, not just in parenting, but in life. And for the first time in months, the ache in his chest felt just a little lighter. The next morning, Richard Langston made a phone call that surprised even himself. He had barely slept. Theo had woken twice during the night, restless, searching for the comfort he'd found in a stranger's arms. Richard tried to replicate it, the slow rocking, the soft hums. Amara never spoke out loud but somehow made Theo believe he was safe, but he couldn't, not the same way. So, he picked up his phone and called the restaurant. Troy, the manager, answered with his usual polished tone. "Maison Lennox, this is Troy speaking." "This is Richard Langston," he said plainly. "I'd like to speak with the young woman who helped me last night, Amara." There was a pause, long enough for Richard to know exactly what was being thought on the other end. "I'm sorry, sir," Troy finally said. "We don't typically give out employee contact information. but I'll be happy to pass along a message." Richard's tone didn't rise, but it sharpened. "That won't be necessary. I'd like to offer her a position." "A position?" "Yes, as a full-time caregiver for my son." Troy went silent again. Then came the defensiveness. "With all due respect, Mr. Langston, Amara is part of our diversity initiative. She's a reliable team member. We've invested in training her." "And yet last night, you tried to stop her from helping me," Richard replied, "because she didn't fit your picture of the right kind of help." Troy stammered. "That's not what I—" Richard cut him off. "She was the only one in that room who saw my son as more than a problem, more than a noise. She saw him as a person. That's not something you train, that's something you either have or you don't." Troy cleared his throat. "I'm sure she'll make the decision that's best for her." "She already did," Richard said flatly. "Last night." He hung up. Later that day, he returned to the restaurant. Not with an entourage, not with security. Just with Theo in a stroller and an envelope containing a formal offer. Full-time salary. Benefits, flexible hours, tuition support if she chose to keep studying. Amara was stunned. "I don't want to take you away from anything," Richard said, "but if you'll help raise my son, I promise to never treat you like anything less than the person who saved him." In that moment, a line that had been drawn by society, by race, class, money, was quietly, decisively erased. 2 weeks later, Amara found herself standing in the private elevator of a glass tower overlooking Central Park, still wearing the same white sneakers she had walked to work in every day for the past 2 years. She had accepted Richard's offer after a long conversation with her roommate and a quiet visit to her mother's grave. She didn't say yes because of the money, though it was more than she'd ever made in her life. She said yes because of Theo. Because when she held that baby, something inside her felt purposeful, needed. The penthouse was quiet when she arrived, not cold, just still. It wasn't the kind of place where children usually played. Everything was white or glass or gray, expensive, immaculate, and empty. Richard met her at the door with no assistant in sight. He looked different, not less sharp, but less guarded. He offered her coffee. She declined. He smiled. Not the boardroom kind, a real one. Theo crawled across the plush rug, reaching for her before she even sat down. "You made an impression," Richard said, watching his son light up. "So did he," Amara replied, scooping Theo into her lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. The days that followed were a new rhythm. Amara was no longer rushing table to table, memorizing orders and dodging comments. She now had one job: to care for a child who had once only known her through a 5-minute connection. But it was more than childcare. Richard started coming home earlier. He asked her questions about Theo, what he liked, how to soothe him. He sat on the floor, tie loosened, watching as Amara taught him to understand his own son. They talked during nap times, sometimes about parenting, sometimes about grief. One afternoon, Richard asked her what she wanted to do once she graduated. "I want to open a center," she said, "for kids like Theo, ones who lose something too early and don't know how to say what they feel." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "We'll make that happen." She didn't know what "we" meant just yet. But in a penthouse high above the city, with the soft sound of a baby breathing peacefully in her arms, Amara realized something. She hadn't just stepped into a new job. She had stepped into a place where healing for all of them was finally possible. They didn't talk about it at first. Not really. Grief has a way of sitting quietly in the corner, like a guest who overstays their welcome. It doesn't demand attention, but it's always there, reshaping the space around it. For Richard, it showed up in the empty side of the bed, in the unused baby clothes still folded in the closet, in the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, like a thought had slipped through a hole only he could feel. For Amara, grief lived in memories she didn't always have time to process. Her mother's voice humming in the kitchen, the last voicemail she never deleted. The call she received while in class, when time fractured and nothing made sense afterward. 2 very different lives, 2 very different losses. But somehow, their pain spoke the same language. One afternoon, while Theo napped on a blanket by the window, Amara sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. Richard sat across from her, shirt sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but open. I still hear her sometimes, Amara said, breaking the silence. Not in a creepy way. Just in the things I say, in how I hold him. Richard nodded slowly. I still reach for her in the morning, he admitted. It's the first thing I do even now, like my body hasn't caught up to the truth. They sat with that for a while. Not to fix it, just to feel it. I used to think grief was something you moved through, Amara said. Like a tunnel. But it's not. It's more like a room, and you just learn how to live inside it. Richard looked at her, and for once, he didn't hide what was in his eyes. You make the room less cold. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It wasn't even close to that. But it was honest. And sometimes, honesty is the only light that can cut through the dark. They didn't need to be each other's solution. They had simply become mirrors reflecting the parts of one another that still needed space to heal. And in that quiet, shared understanding, something began to grow. Not love. Not yet. But trust. The kind that comes from surviving the same storm and choosing, somehow, to stay in the boat together. It didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic transformation, no sweeping music or movie-like montage of healing and smiles. It was slow, gentle, real. Amara continued to care for Theo not just as a job, but as a calling. She became more than a caretaker. She became a rhythm in the boy's life. The laughter in the morning, the calm in the evening, the constant in a world that had shifted too soon. Richard, in turn, began to reintroduce himself to fatherhood, not as a man performing it, but as someone learning it. Awkward at first, clumsy in the way most men are when they're used to being in control. But he tried. He showed up, and Amara, without judgment, guided him through it all. They didn't need to say much. The house slowly changed on its own. Toys left out without guilt. Laughter echoing through high ceilings. One corner of the living room slowly transforming into a children's reading nook. One day, Theo took his first steps toward Amara, and she cried, holding him like he had just given her a reason to believe in something bigger than pain. That night, Richard looked at her from across the kitchen island and said, "You've changed everything." She smiled, brushing a curl behind her ear. You just stopped running from it. They never made it about race. But it was always there, the quiet awareness of how unlikely this story was. How a young black woman from Newark ended up in the home of a billionaire, not as a statistic or stereotype, but as someone essential. And maybe that's the real story. Not the viral headlines or whispered gossip from fancy dinner parties. But this. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who end up saving us. Sometimes Grace walks in wearing sneakers and carrying a burden no one sees and still chooses kindness anyway. And sometimes, the life you thought had shattered gets rebuilt through the most unexpected hands. That's the kind of story we don't hear enough. A story of healing, of shared humanity, of barriers broken not with speeches, but with presence. So, if this touched you even for a moment, let it remind you of something. We all have the power to hold someone together, even when we ourselves are falling apart. That's what Amara did. That's what we can all do, in our own way. If this black story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories that bring us back to what truly matters. Because the world is full of noise, but the quietest moments, they're the ones that change everything.